Jasmine Crockett answered Donald Trump's insult about her look by wearing the 19th Amendment to the State of the Union, letting the elegant embroidery on her dress make a statement so powerful she never had to say a word. Within minutes of her entrance into the House chamber, the internet was a wildfire of screenshots. Political reporters, usually focused on the pre-speech handshakes and seating arrangements, were scrambling, aiming their camera phones not at the dais, but at a flash of cobalt blue moving through the crowd. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag the right look was born and began climbing the global trending charts with dizzying speed. Fashion magazines, caught completely off guard, had teams frantically writing articles not about runway trends, but about constitutional amendments. News anchors, live on air, squinted at their monitors, their producers' voices crackling in their earpieces, trying to confirm the impossible: that the swirling silver pattern on the Congresswoman's dress was actual text. The text of the 19th Amendment. It wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a silent, perfectly aimed political counterpunch that landed with the force of a thunderclap, and the whole world was watching. 2 days earlier, the air on the White House South Lawn had been thick with the rhythmic thumping of Marine One's rotors. Donald Trump, on his way to a rally in Pennsylvania, stopped to speak with the press, a familiar ritual of controlled chaos. He stood, framed by the green lawn and the presidential helicopter, basking in the attention. A reporter from a mainstream network, fighting to be heard over the noise, shouted a question about Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had recently delivered a scathing floor speech criticizing Trump's proposed budget cuts to education and health care. "Mr. Trump," Congresswoman Crockett said, "your budget preys on the vulnerable." Your response, Trump's face, a mask of performative indignation, tightened. He waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Crockett, her," he began, the casual disregard a weapon in itself. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's got a lot to say, that one. A lot of noise. You know, to be in this job, to be in these halls," he gestured vaguely toward the Capitol building in the distance, "you need to have a certain look, a presence. You need to be classy, presidential." He paused, letting the implication hang in the rotor-chopped air. "She just doesn't have the right look. Not for Congress, not for this stage." He then pivoted, ignoring the follow-up questions, and walked toward Marine One, leaving the press scrum to explode in a frenzy of alerts and notifications. Miles away, in her small D.C. office, Jasmine Crockett watched the clip on her phone. She didn't flinch. Her chief of aide, a sharp, perpetually stressed woman named Maya, was practically vibrating with fury beside her. "He can't say that. It's misogynistic. It's racist. It's grounds for a censure." Maya was already pacing, her mind racing through press releases and cable news bookings. "We can get her on Anderson Cooper tonight. Rachel Maddow tomorrow. We can make him own this." Jasmine held up a hand, her eyes still fixed on the screen. Replaying the moment, she wasn't angry. Anger was a hot, messy emotion, and what she felt was the exact opposite, a cold, clarifying focus. She saw the insult for what it was, a deliberate attempt to reduce her, a sitting United States Congresswoman, to her physical appearance. It was a tactic as old as time, designed to knock a woman off her footing, to make her defensive, to lure her into a shouting match she couldn't win. He wanted her to get loud. He wanted her to get emotional. He expected her to fight on his terms, in his arena of personal slights and loud grievances. She locked her phone and turned to Maya, whose frustration was now bordering on panic. "Cancel the bookings," Jasmine said, her voice quiet but firm. Stopped pacing. "Cancel them. Jasmine, this is a gift. We have to hit back hard." "We will," Jasmine replied, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, but not with noise. "We'll hit back with a statement." She walked over to her desk, picking up a pen and a blank sheet of paper. She looked at her aide, her eyes holding a glint of steel. "He wants to talk about the right look. Fine, let's talk about the right to be here in the first place." She turned away and picked up her personal cell phone. She found the name she was looking for, an independent designer based in New York, known for her intricate beadwork and bold, narrative-driven pieces. She pressed the call button. "Hi, it's Jasmine," she said when the designer answered, her voice low and conspiratorial. "I have an idea for the State of the Union. It's in 2 days, but it needs to be perfect, and it needs to be silent. The day of the State of the Union address was a study in orchestrated chaos. The Capitol buzzed with an energy that was part political Super Bowl, part high school reunion. In her temporary office, Jasmine Crockett was the picture of calm. Maya was a whirlwind of frantic energy, armed with a binder 3 inches thick, filled with potential talking points, policy rebuttals, and social media drafts. Okay, if he mentions the border, we pivot to the economic impact on Texas communities. If he talks about judicial appointments, we highlight the backlog he created. If he so much as breathes the word education, we have the stats on teacher shortages ready to go, she rattled off, adjusting Jasmine's collar. Jasmine just nodded, her focus elsewhere. The most important statement isn't in the binder, Maya, she said, gesturing to the closet. It's in the garment bag. Inside the long black bag hung the dress. It had arrived by special courier just hours before, a marvel of last-minute artistry and shared purpose. The designer had worked for 36 hours straight, calling in her entire team, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of indignation. They understood the mission completely. It wasn't a commission. It was a conspiracy. When Jasmine finally stepped out of her office to head to the Capitol, she wore a simple, long black overcoat that concealed the dress entirely. The decision was deliberate. The reveal had to happen in the right place, at the right time. Walking through the marble halls, she was just another one of the hundreds of lawmakers making their way to the House chamber. She nodded to colleagues, exchanged pleasantries, her demeanor giving no hint of the sartorial bombshell she was about to detonate. The tension was in the silence. It was in the knowledge of what she was about to do. Trump had thrown a stone, expecting a splash. He had no idea she was about to return it as a tidal wave. She reached the antechamber of the House, the final checkpoint, before entering the floor. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, hairspray, and ambition. This was it, the battlefield. She took a quiet breath, her fingers finding the buttons of her overcoat. This wasn't just for her. This was for every woman who had ever been. Told to smile more, to speak less, to know her place. This was for the women who had fought for the right to even be in this room. With a steady hand, she undid the buttons. She handed the coat to Maya without a word and turned to face the entrance of the chamber. The moment she stepped into the light of the House chamber, the physics of the room seemed to shift. The initial reaction was a ripple, not a wave. A few heads turned, drawn by the vibrant, almost electric cobalt blue of the dress. It was a stunning color, a slash of defiance in a sea of navy, gray, and black suits. But it was the cut that held the eye, elegant, powerful, with clean lines that projected a sense of unwavering confidence. For a few seconds, that was all anyone saw, a beautifully dressed congresswoman taking her place. Then, a photographer from the Associated Press, perched on a balcony high above the floor, zoomed in. His job was to capture the details others missed: whispered conversation, a revealing facial expression, the fine print. His lens moved down the fabric of the dress, and he froze. It wasn't a pattern, it wasn't floral or geometric, it was words. He adjusted his focus, his heart starting to pound. Silver thread, intricately embroidered, coiled around the dress from shoulder to hem. He could make out a phrase, ... the right of citizens of the United States to vote, ... He started snapping pictures, the rapid-fire click of his shutter, an unheard drumbeat in the cavernous room. He sent the first image to his editor with a one-word caption, "Look." Down on the floor, the realization spread more slowly, passed by whispers and glances. A congresswoman from California leaned over to her colleague from Illinois. "Look at Jasmine's dress," she murmured. The Illinois representative squinted, her eyes widening as she recognized the script. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Is that the—" Whisper became a murmur, a low hum of dawning comprehension that began to spread from the Democratic side of the aisle. Staffers in the galleries were pointing, their own phones emerging to capture the moment. On the other side of the room, Republican members looked on, first with curiosity, then with a mixture of confusion and dawning unease. They could feel the energy shifting, the focus of the entire chamber coalescing around the woman in blue. But they didn't yet understand why. Jasmine moved through the room with a deliberate, unhurried grace. She wasn't seeking attention. She was a vessel for it. She greeted colleagues with a calm nod and a quiet smile, her composure a stark contrast to the growing buzz around her. Each step was a beat in a silent symphony of defiance. The words woven into her dress were a ghost in the room, a historical echo made tangible. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. A veteran reporter for a major newspaper, standing near the side entrance, saw it. He had covered dozens of these events and thought he had seen every form of political theater imaginable. But this was different. This wasn't a protest pin or a colored ribbon. This was the very fabric of the garment, a statement so deeply integrated it was inseparable from the person wearing it. He started typing furiously into his phone, his dispatch to the news desk reading, "Forget the speech. The story is Jasmine Crockett's dress." It's the 19th Amendment, a direct, silent response to Trump. By the time Jasmine reached her assigned seat, the chamber was a hive of clandestine communication. Phones were buzzing in pockets and purses. Aides were sending frantic texts. The digital world was already exploding, but inside the hallowed hall. The revolution was happening in sidelong glances and stunned silence. She sat down, smoothed the fabric of her dress, and looked straight ahead towards the speaker's dais. She didn't look around to gauge the reaction. She didn't need to. She could feel it. When the sergeant-at-arms finally announced the President of the United States and Donald Trump walked down the center aisle to a divided chorus of applause and silence, he was walking into a room that had already been claimed. He was the main event, the ostensible center of power. But the narrative of the night had been hijacked before he had even uttered a single word. He shook hands, he waved, he basked in the glow of the television lights, completely oblivious to the fact that the most powerful statement of the evening had already been made. He saw a woman in a blue dress. He had no idea he was looking at a walking, breathing, silent rebuttal, a history lesson woven in thread, aimed directly at him. The confrontation wasn't in a shout, it was in the stitching, and the quiet hum of that realization was more deafening than any applause. Throughout the 90-minute speech, Jasmine Crockett sat as still as a statue, a cobalt blue anchor in a restless sea of political maneuvering. While Donald Trump's voice boomed from the rostrum, detailing his vision for the nation, a silent, secondary narrative was being broadcast to the millions watching at home. Network directors, recognizing the potent symbolism, began a delicate dance with their cameras. They would show Trump at the podium, his face contorted with passion as he spoke of strength and heritage, then cut to a wide shot of the chamber. Before slowly zooming in on the silver script adorning Crockett's dress, it was a visual conversation, a point-counterpoint playing out in real time. When Trump boasted about the number of women in the workforce, the camera found Jasmine. Her expression was neutral, but the amendment stitched onto her sleeve seemed to offer a silent correction. The right to economic freedom was built on the foundation of political freedom. When he launched into a tirade about election integrity, lambasting his opponents for questioning the system, the camera cut to a close-up of the words, "shall not be denied or abridged" on her dress. The juxtaposition was electric, transforming his generic talking points into a direct, if one-sided, debate with history itself. Jasmine could feel the eyes on her, not just the lenses of the cameras, but the gazes of her colleagues. Across the aisle, she saw a veteran Republican senator, a man she had clashed with in committee meetings, pointedly turn his back to her, engaging in an overly animated conversation with his neighbor, a clear refusal to acknowledge her presence or her statement. It was a dismissal, but a loud one. It told her the message had been received. A few rows ahead of her, one of the newer, more progressive congressmen caught her eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a grin spreading across his face. It was a sign of alliance, of shared victory. But the most meaningful glance came from a woman she deeply respected, an elderly senator from the Pacific Northwest, one of the longest-serving women in the history of the Senate. The senator had been a trailblazer, fighting lonely battles in these same halls when the idea of a woman in power was still a novelty. Their eyes met across the crowded chamber. The old senator's face, etched with the lines of 100 political wars, broke into a small, subtle smile. She gave Jasmine a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't just approval, it was a passing of the torch, a recognition that the fight continued, evolving in its tactics but constant in its purpose. In that silent exchange, Jasmine felt the weight and the strength of the generations of women who had come before her. Finally, the speech ended. The requisite standing ovation began, a fractured and partisan affair. As the chamber began to empty, the real storm broke. The antechamber, which she had entered in relative anonymity, was now a solid wall of bodies, a frenzied scrum of reporters, producers, and photographers. The moment she emerged, the noise was a physical force. Flashes strobed, creating a disorienting, blinding effect. Microphones and smartphones were thrust into her face. "Congresswoman! Congresswoman!" The shouts came from all directions, a chaotic chorus of demands. Was the dress a message for President Trump? A reporter from CNN yelled. "Who is the designer? Who are you wearing tonight?" screamed a correspondent from a fashion outlet, their question sounding absurdly frivolous amidst the political cacophony. "What do you say to your critics, who will call this a political stunt?" A journalist from a conservative network pressed, his voice sharp with accusation. Maya, her aide, tried to form a protective barrier, her arms out as she repeated, "No comment. We have no comment at this time," but she was quickly overwhelmed. This was the critical moment. This was where the narrative could be lost. One defensive answer, one flash of anger, one wavering response, and her carefully constructed statement would crumble. Trump's allies would paint her as a theatrical lightweight, more interested in fashion than policy. But Jasmine remained serene. She paused, not out of hesitation, but to command the space. The frenzy seemed too quiet for a fraction of a second, the reporters sensing she was about to speak. She looked over the sea of faces and microphones, her expression calm and unreadable. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to be heard over the din, and spoke 3 simple words. "The dress," she said, her voice clear and steady, "speaks for itself." And with that, she turned and continued to walk, Maya clearing a path behind her. The reporters were left in her wake, momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer finality of her response. She had refused to explain. She had refused to defend. She had forced them, and the world, to contend with the statement on its own terms. She didn't need to add a single word. The message was the message. The walk from the chamber to her office felt like miles. By the time the heavy wooden door closed, behind her, sealing out the noise of the hallway, the digital world had already been irrevocably altered. Maya immediately turned on the television, flipping to a news channel where a panel of pundits was already dissecting the moment. Their faces a mixture of shock and awe. On the screen, a split view showed Trump waving from his motorcade on one side, and a high-resolution image of Crockett's dress on the other. "I have never, in 30 years of covering politics, seen anything like it," one analyst was saying. This wasn't just a protest. This was a non-verbal filibuster. She dominated the conversation of the night without opening her mouth. Jasmine ignored the television. She sank into her office chair and finally pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with an impossible cascade of notifications, texts, emails, missed calls, and thousands of social media alerts. She opened X, and the first thing she saw was the hashtag. Hashtag the right look was the #1 trend worldwide. Below it were hashtag 19th Amendment and hashtag Jasmine Crockett. She scrolled, her thumb moving over a torrent of images and words. The memes were already there, lightning fast and razor sharp. One showed a side-by-side of Trump's quote, "She just doesn't have the right look," next to a close-up of the elegant, powerful script on her dress. Another had her face photoshopped onto the iconic "We Can Do It" poster, but instead of a factory uniform, she was wearing the cobalt dress. Then came the analysis. A noted presidential historian had tweeted, "For those asking why this matters, the leaders of the suffrage movement were relentlessly attacked for their unladylike appearance and hysterical demeanor. They were told they lacked the right. Look for public life." By wearing the 19th, Representative Crockett didn't just clap back at Trump. She weaponized a century of misogynistic criticism against its modern-day echo. The post had been retweeted over 50,000 times in less than an hour. A constitutional lawyer she respected had posted a thread. Legally, it's fascinating. She used the foundational text of a civil right as a shield against political attack. It elevates the debate from partisan squabbling to a question of fundamental principles. It asks, what does it mean to have a right if the person exercising it is still subject to these kinds of attacks? Even the fashion world, which often existed in its own apolitical bubble, understood the gravity. The editor-in-chief of a major fashion magazine had written a rare personal post on Instagram accompanied by a photo of the dress. Forget the red carpet. This is not a best-dressed moment. This is a moment of historical iconography. This is a garment that will be in a museum one day. It is a testament to the fact that fashion, at its most powerful, is not about aesthetics, but about identity, narrative, and defiance. This is political art of the highest order. International news outlets were running with it too. The BBC's lead story on its American politics page wasn't about Trump's policy proposals. It was a deep dive into the history of the suffrage movement, using the dress as a modern-day entry point. An anchor on a German news network explained to his viewers that it was a profound example of how American political discourse could be fought through symbolism as much as through debate. Jasmine put the phone down. The sheer scale of the reaction washing over her, she had known it would make a statement, but she hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't anticipated that her silent act of defiance would become a global conversation, a canvas onto which millions of people were projecting their own experiences, their own frustrations, their own hopes. She had intended to send a message to one man. Instead, the message had been delivered to the entire world. The dress no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the moment, and the night she knew was far from over. The adrenaline that had carried her through the evening finally evaporated around 2 a.m., leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the earlier noise. Jasmine was back in her featureless DC apartment, the kind of temporary housing that never feels like home. The cobalt dress was hung carefully on the back of her bedroom door, its silver threads catching the faint glow of the city lights outside her window. It looked like a museum piece already, a relic from another life. The woman who had worn it with such unshakable confidence felt like a stranger. The woman who was left, curled up on the bland beige sofa in an old sweatshirt and leggings, was just Jasmine, and she was bone-deep tired. She had made the mistake of picking up her phone again. This time, she didn't stop at the trending topics or the praise from fellow politicians and celebrities. Driven by a kind of morbid curiosity, a need to see the full battlefield, she navigated to the darker corners of the internet. She went into the comment sections of right-wing news sites that had posted the story. She opened the message requests folder on her Instagram, the digital junk drawer where the unvetted and unhinged ended up. The praise had been a tidal wave, but the hate was a toxic sludge. It was raw, personal, and profoundly violent. The words swam before her eyes, each one a tiny poison dart. Arrogant bitch thinks wearing a fancy dress makes her important. Go back to the kitchen where you belong. What a classless stunt. Trump was right. She don't have the look. She looks like a stripper who got lost on the way to the club. The messages grew darker, the racism more explicit. One user, with a profile picture of a snarling wolf, sent a direct message detailing, in graphic terms, what he would do to her if he ever saw her alone. Another had created a disgusting meme that superimposed her face onto a historical image of a slave. The caption read, "Know your place." They came one after another, an endless torrent of vitriol. They attacked her intelligence, they threatened her family. They posted her office address with suggestions that a patriot should pay her a visit. Each message chipped away at the armor she had worn so proudly just hours before. The confident Congresswoman who had faced down the cameras felt her stomach clench with a primal, sickening fear. This was the cost. This was the tax levied on a woman, especially a black woman, who dared to seize power. They didn't just disagree with her. They wanted to annihilate her, to erase her, to silence her, not with debate, but with brute force and terror. She felt a tremor in her hands and quickly put the phone down, face down on the cushion beside her, as if to smother the voices pouring out of it. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the words were burned onto the inside of her eyelids. She reached for the phone again, her fingers shaking slightly, and dialed a number she knew by heart. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice warm and laced with sleep. "Jasmine, baby, is everything all right?" "Hi, Mama," Jasmine said, trying to keep her voice even, but a telltale crackle betrayed her. "I saw you, honey. Oh, I saw you. You looked like a queen up there on that television, her mother began, her voice swelling with pride. Your aunties have been calling all night. Your cousin Cherise posted that picture of your dress on her Facebook, and it has 1,000 likes. We are all so proud. I'm glad, Mama, Jasmine whispered. That's what I was hoping for. There was a pause. Her mother's tone shifted, the pride giving way to a familiar, deep-seated worry. But I'm worried, Jasmine. I made the mistake of reading some of the comments online. The things those people are calling you, the threats they're making. It's filth. Mama, don't read that stuff, Jasmine said, a little too quickly. It's just trolls, ignorant people with keyboards. They're just trying to scare me. And are you scared? Her mother asked gently, the question landing with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Jasmine let out a long, shuddering breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Yes, she admitted, the word tasting like defeat. Yes, Mama, I'm scared. She could feel tears welling, hot and unwelcome. They're hateful. It's so ugly. Then I have to ask, baby. Her mother's voice was soft, but firm with a mother's fierce love. Is it worth it? Is it worth all this ugliness? Putting yourself in their line of fire like this for a dress? The question hung in the air, the same question she had been asking herself in the dark, lonely apartment for a dress. Was this whole firestorm, this risk to her safety and her family's peace of mind, really just about a piece of clothing? Jasmine pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. It was never about the dress, Mama, she said. The dress was just the weapon. The fight is about what he said, what he tried to do. She took a breath. He tried to make me small. He tried to tell the whole world that a woman like me, a black woman from Texas, doesn't belong in that room unless she looks and acts a certain way. His way, she continued, the words coming faster now, fueled by a conviction that pushed back against the fear. If I let him do that, if I let him get away with telling me I don't have the right look to be where I am, then what am I even doing? Here, what does that say to all the other little girls watching, the ones who look like me, that they should be quiet to be safe, that they should shrink themselves to fit into rooms that weren't built for them? I can't do that, Mama. I won't. She could hear her mother crying softly on the other end of the line. I know, baby. I know you won't. That's why I'm so proud and so scared. I know, Jasmine said, her own tears now flowing freely. Me too. They stayed on the phone for another hour, talking about family gossip. Her father's stubborn refusal to fix the leaky faucet, the plot of a soap opera her mother was watching. They talked about everything and nothing, the mundane conversation. A lifeline back to a world where her life wasn't a trending topic. A world where she was just a daughter, not a symbol. When she finally hung up, the exhaustion had returned. But it was different now. It was layered with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in charge. The next morning, the battle for the narrative was in full swing. On conservative talk radio, the dress was being ridiculed as a woke publicity stunt. A prominent host spent a full segment mocking her. While you were struggling to pay for gas, Congresswoman Crockett was busy commissioning a designer gown to own the libs, he sneered. This is what's wrong with Washington. All theater, no substance. She's distracting from the real issues because she has no real solutions. On the other side of the media ecosystem, she was being canonized. Progressive morning shows had panels, deconstructing the genius of her silent protest. Historians were brought on to explain the deep-rooted significance of her choice. It was a Rorschach test for the nation's political soul in her office, which was now filled with so many floral arrangements it looked like a funeral home. Maya was fighting a losing battle with the phones. She had a whiteboard out, trying to triage the media requests. Okay, Maya said, pointing a frantic pen at the board. The New York Times wants an op-ed. The View wants you for a full hour. Good Morning America is offering you the opening segment. Every major podcast, from political to cultural, has reached out. They all want you. They want the victory lap. Jasmine, sipping a cup of strong black coffee, shook her head. No. Maya stared at her, dumbfounded. No, Jasmine, this is our chance to cement the win. To control the narrative. We already did, Jasmine countered. The statement was made in silence. Explaining it in a dozen interviews only diminishes it. It cheapens it. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the DC traffic. I am not going to spend the next week talking about a piece of fabric. Donald Trump doesn't get to set my agenda. Not yesterday, not today. She turned back to her aide. I want you to draft a statement, a simple one. Post it on all my channels. Thank everyone for the overwhelming support. Say that you are moved and humbled by the conversation. Okay, Maya said, grabbing a notepad. Then Jasmine continued, her voice sharp with command, you pivot. Write that the best way to honor the spirit of the 19th Amendment is not just to talk about it, but to protect and expand the right it guarantees. Announce that tomorrow. I will be introducing the Voter Access and Protection Act. Link the symbolism directly to substance. The dress was the headline. Now we give them the story. Maya looked up from her notes, a slow smile spreading across her face. She finally understood. This was the real counterpunch. The dress wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning. He wants to talk about looks, Jasmine said, a spark of fire in her eyes. Fine. Let's make him look at the law. The statement announcing the Voter Access and Protection Act landed like a perfectly timed aftershock. It was a brilliant tactical move, catching her opponents flat-footed. They were geared up to fight a culture war battle over a dress, to paint her as a frivolous celebrity politician. But she had refused to engage, instead changing the battlefield entirely. Now, to attack her was to attack the principle of voting rights, a far more difficult proposition. The conversation for a news cycle or two shifted from fashion to filibusters, from symbolism to legislation. Yet the debate over the dress itself continued to simmer, settling into the predictable trenches of a polarized America. It became a partisan litmus test. If you were on the right, it was a disrespectful, theatrical stunt. If you were on the left, it was a masterful stroke of political genius. The narrative was stuck, looping endlessly in the cable news echo chamber. For the next few days, it seemed destined to fade into just another forgotten hashtag, another brief flare-up in the endless political bonfire. Then, on a Thursday night, the stalemate was broken by the most unlikely of sources. Judge Annabelle Sterling was a titan of the conservative legal world, appointed to the federal bench by a Republican president in the 1980s. She had retired after a distinguished, if controversial, career. Now, she hosted a primetime cable news show, The Gavel, where she dissected legal and political issues from a staunchly originalist perspective. She was known for her sharp mind, her sharper tongue, and her general disdain for what she considered the emotional theatrics of modern progressive politics. Her audience was loyal, mainstream conservative, and they tuned in that night fully, expecting her to dismantle Jasmine Crockett with the cold, logical precision of a legal brief. She began her opening monologue from behind her imposing oak desk, her steely gray hair perfectly coiffed, her expression stern. Good evening, she said, her voice a low, authoritative baritone. A great deal has been said this past week about the State of the Union address. Or rather, a great deal has been said about a dress worn at the State of the Union address. Many of you are likely expecting me to condemn Congresswoman Crockett's display as the kind of political theater that has replaced serious debate in this country. She paused, letting the expectations settle in the minds of her viewers across the nation. And you would be wrong. A stunned silence seemed to emanate from the television itself. In the control room, her producer's jaw literally dropped. Sterling leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into the camera lens. Let me be unequivocally clear. I disagree with Congresswoman Crockett on nearly every substantive policy issue. Her vision for America is, in my view, profoundly misguided. Her voting record is antithetical to the principles of limited government and fiscal responsibility that I hold dear. We would likely not find common ground on any piece of legislation. But this was not about legislation. This was about language, and it was about the proper response to an abuse of that language. She held up a finger. Observe the facts. The former President of the United States, when asked to respond to a policy critique, chose not to engage with the substance of that critique. Instead, he deployed a classic ad hominem attack, one of the oldest and laziest logical fallacies. He attacked the Congresswoman's appearance. He sought to delegitimize her as a person in order to avoid debating her ideas. This is a tactic of intellectual weakness, and it was beneath the dignity of the office he once held. Her tone was that of a professor lecturing a class of unruly students. Now, consider the response. Congresswoman Crockett did not, in turn, sink to his level. She did not offer an insult of her own. She did not get emotional. She did not, as her critics claim, engage in childish theatrics. She did something far more interesting. She did something, I would argue, that was profoundly conservative in its nature. Another silence. The word conservative hung in the air, a deliberate provocation to her audience. She responded to a petty, personal insult by cloaking herself, literally, in the text of the Constitution. She answered an attack on her look with the foundational law that guarantees her right, and the right of every woman in this nation. She elevated the conversation. While the former president sought to drag the debate into the gutter, she lifted it to the level of first principles. This is a conservative idea, that our institutions, our laws, and the very words of our founding documents are more powerful and more permanent than the whims of any single person, no matter how powerful. Her statement was not, "I am beautiful." Her statement was, "This amendment is beautiful." It was a defensive principle over personality. It was an act of reverence for the law. She sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. I will continue to vigorously oppose the policies of Congresswoman Crockett. I will debate them on this program and in any other forum. But I will not stand by while the fundamental respect owed to her office and the brilliant, uniquely American way in which she chose to defend it is mischaracterized as a mere stunt. It was a masterclass in civic discourse, and those who cannot see that are, I suspect, blinded by a partisanship that prevents them from recognizing a defensive constitutional principle when it is staring them in the face, woven in silver thread. The monologue ended. Judge Sterling shuffled her papers, and the show cut to a commercial, but the impact was immediate and seismic. Clips of the monologue ripped across the internet, shared not just by gleeful Democrats, but by a stunned and intrigued subset of conservatives, libertarians, and independents. Hashtag Judge Sterling was trending within the hour. She had given permission for people to see the event outside of their political silos. She hadn't changed their minds about policy, but she had reframed the Crockett-Trump exchange entirely, from a spat between enemies to a lesson in civics. The ground had been tilled. The nation now was listening in a new way. A week after the State of the Union, Jasmine Crockett decided it was time. The furious storm had passed, replaced by a more thoughtful, more nuanced national conversation, thanks in large part to Judge Sterling's unexpected intervention. The hundreds of media requests were still pouring in, but Jasmine continued to ignore them. She would not let her message be filtered through a panel of pundits or a host's agenda. She would speak directly to the people on her own terms. Evening, she went live on her Instagram account from her D.C. office. There was no professional lighting, no makeup artist, no teleprompter. It was just her, sitting at her desk, the flag of the United States and the flag of Texas standing behind her. She looked into the camera of her phone, her expression calm and earnest, and began to speak. "Good evening, everyone," she started, a small, genuine smile on her face. "It's been quite a week. I've seen the messages, the articles, the news reports. I've read the tweets, and I've been truly humbled by the outpouring of support from so many people, from all walks of life, and, in some cases, from some very unexpected corners. So, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you, and to talk to you directly." She took a quiet breath. "A lot of people have asked me why I did it, why I chose to wear that dress. The truth is, it was never about a dress. It was about the right to be seen. It was about the right to be heard. It was about the right to have a seat at the table without your appearance, your gender, or the color of your skin being used as a weapon to diminish your voice. When the former president said I didn't have the right look for Congress, I knew what he was doing. It's a tactic that has been used against women, and especially women of color, for centuries. It's an attempt to shift the focus from what we say to how we look. It's a way to imply that we are objects to be judged, not leaders to be heard." She leaned in slightly, her gaze intense. "The women who fought for the 19th Amendment, the words I was proud to wear, were called hysterical. They were arrested, they were beaten, they were told they were unladylike and unnatural. They were told, in the language of their time, that they did not have the right look for politics. When I heard those same echoes in 2025, I knew I couldn't respond with just words. I had to respond with their words. My response wasn't just for me, it was for them. It was a thank you, and it was a promise to continue their fight. Because symbolism, as powerful as it is not enough. A statement must be followed by action. The fight for our democracy is not won on red carpets or in the halls of Congress alone. It is won at the ballot box. It is won when every single eligible citizen has the free and fair opportunity to make their voice heard. That is why this week I introduced the Voter Access and Protection Act, because the ultimate answer to anyone who questions our right to be in the room is to ensure that millions more have the undeniable, unimpeded right to vote us into it. That is how we honor our history. That is how we secure our future. She ended with a simple, powerful look into the camera. Thank you for listening. Now, let's get to work. She tapped the screen, and the live feed ended. She had spoken for less than 5 minutes, but in that short time she had defined the narrative, claimed her victory, and transformed a viral moment into a political movement. She hadn't just won the argument, she had transcended it. Jasmine Crockett's video was a declaration of principle, and it landed with the force of one. For a few days, it seemed as if the entire political world was operating on her terms. Her proposed voting rights bill became the central topic of discussion on news shows, with legal experts debating its merits and her opponents forced to argue against its substance rather than her character. She had, through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance, turned a personal insult into a national legislative priority. But Washington has a short memory. By the end of the month, the news cycle, in its insatiable hunger for the next controversy, had moved on. A new political firestorm had erupted, a fresh scandal was being dissected, and the image of the cobalt blue dress began to fade from the front pages, relegated to year-end wrap-ups and future historical retrospectives. The hashtags stopped trending. The immediate feverish energy of the moment dissipated, as it always does. To many, it might have seemed like the story was over. But the true impact of an event like this is rarely measured in headlines or trending topics. It is measured in the quiet, unseen echoes it creates, the subtle ways it changes the calculus of power in rooms far from the Capitol dome. 3 weeks after the State of the Union, in a brightly lit classroom in a suburban Ohio high school, Sarah Jenkins was trying to teach history. It was a daily struggle. Her 11th grade students, raised on a diet of 15-second videos and ephemeral memes, found it difficult to connect with the dusty, sepia-toned world of the past. To them, the Constitution was a boring document, and political discourse was just a bunch of old people yelling at each other on TV. Sarah, a passionate teacher who believed deeply in the power of civics, often felt like she was losing the battle for their attention. But the story of Jasmine Crockett's dress had been different. It had cut through their cynicism. They had seen it on their own social media feeds, not just on the news. They had seen the memes, the reactions, the sheer drama of it. For the first time all year, they were talking about politics with a spark of genuine interest. Sarah decided to seize the opportunity. That Tuesday, she structured her entire lesson around it. She projected 3 video clips onto the screen at the front of the classroom. First, the clip of Donald Trump on the White House lawn, the helicopter blades thumping as he dismissed Crockett for not having the right look. Next, she showed the silent, stunning news footage of Crockett walking into the House chamber, the camera slowly zooming in on the silver script of the 19th Amendment. Finally, she played the clip of Judge Annabelle Sterling's monologue, her stern, authoritative voice filling the classroom. When the videos were done, she turned to her students. "Okay," she said, "let's talk about it. What did you just see?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a boy in the back row named Kevin, who usually spent class trying to beat levels on his phone, raised his hand. I saw it all over TikTok," he said. "I thought it was just like a diss track with a dress, kinda savage. But that judge lady, she made it sound like it was important." A young woman named Maria, one of Sarah's brightest students, spoke up next. "My dad says all politicians are just corrupt and yelling at each other. But Crockett didn't yell. She didn't even talk. She just did that. It was so smart. It was a power move that wasn't about being the loudest person in the room." Sarah felt a thrill of excitement. They were getting it. "Exactly, Maria," she said, turning to the whiteboard. "So let's think about that. What are the different forms of protest? Does power always have to be loud? Can silence, Can a symbol be just as powerful as a speech? The discussion took off. The students debated the strategy, the ethics, the impact. They talked about misogyny, the Constitution, and the way media shapes a story. They were engaged, they were critical, and they were connecting a current event to the core principles of the history they were supposed to be learning. For the first time in a long time, Sarah Jenkins didn't feel like she was fighting a losing battle. She felt like she was winning. That evening, the echo of that classroom lesson followed Sarah to a place she usually dreaded, the monthly school board meeting. It was held in the school library, a room that always felt too small and poorly lit for the contentious debates that took place there. The topic of the night was the proposed budget for the following year, and on the chopping block were funds for the arts and humanities, including the money for historical field trips, guest speakers, and even the school's debate team. The board was dominated by a handful of loud, dismissive men, led by its president, a local business owner named Mr. Henderson. He believed these subjects were expensive frills, and that the school's focus should be on more practical skills. Sarah had signed up to speak. Armed with a folder full of data and testimonials from former students, she walked to the flimsy podium when her name was called. She spoke with passion and precision, laying out a fact-based argument for how humanities education was critical, for teaching the very skills critical thinking, persuasive argument, civic engagement that society needed. When she finished, Mr. Henderson looked down at her from the raised dais, a deeply patronizing smile on his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We appreciate your passion, but you seem to be getting a little too emotional about this. We have to be realistic about the budget." The words hit her like a physical blow, too emotional. It was the classic dismissive cudgel used to silence women with strong opinions. In the past, a comment like that would have flustered her. She would have stammered, her face would have flushed with anger and embarrassment, and she would have retreated to her seat, defeated. But tonight was different. As the sting of his words hit her, an image flashed in her mind. Jasmine Crockett, standing serene in a storm of flashing cameras. She thought of the lesson she had just taught her own students about silence and power. Sarah didn't retreat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood at the podium and held her ground. She paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence fill the room. She looked directly at Mr. Henderson, her gaze level and unwavering. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice perfectly calm and clear, every word precisely enunciated, "my emotion comes from my deep commitment to the education of our students, but my argument is based on the facts I just presented." She gestured to her folder. "Perhaps, instead of judging the tone of my voice, you could try addressing the substance of my point." The room fell completely silent. Mr. Henderson's patronizing smile faltered, replaced by a look of shocked surprise. He had expected her to crumble. He had no idea how to respond to her composure. Before he could formulate an answer, another board member, a quiet woman who rarely spoke up, leaned into her microphone. "I agree with Mrs. Jenkins," she said. "Let's look at the data she presented on page 4. The dynamic of the room had fundamentally shifted. Sarah hadn't won the budget vote that night. That battle would continue. But she had won something far more important. She had refused to be diminished. She had held her space. She had answered a personal slight with professional dignity. As she walked back to her seat, her hands were steady and her head was held high. She didn't feel defeated. She felt powerful. The headlines about the cobalt blue dress and the 19th Amendment eventually faded, replaced by the next big story, as all headlines eventually are. But the statement Jasmine Crockett made that night continued to ripple outwards, not in the noisy halls of power, but in the quiet spaces where real life happens. It became a new blueprint, a silent lesson for anyone who had ever been told they were too much or not enough. It showed that the most profound acts of defiance don't always involve shouting, but sometimes simply in standing firm, in full possession of your own worth and letting your statement speak for itself. What does it truly mean to have a voice in a world that constantly tries to judge your appearance? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about people who refuse to be silenced.